Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we've had a flurry of developments in the ongoing saga over the Jeffrey Epstein case, even as the White House is desperately trying to force that story off the front page. Just moments ago, the Wall Street Journal reporting that the Justice Department told the president in May that his name is among many in the Epstein files. That's according to senior administration officials. From the Wall Street Journal's report, a White House spokesman called it a, quote, fake story. Now, we should note that being mentioned in those records is not a sign of wrongdoing. It comes as President Trump is publicly telling Republicans to use his latest strategy to navigate the MAGA-led uproar over the deceased convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Just deflect. Mr. Trump now making baseless accusations that former President Obama tried to influence the 2016 election as a way to change the subject.
You should mention that every time they give you a question that's not appropriate. Just say, oh, by the way, Obama cheated on the election. You'll watch the camera turn off instantly.
Now, today, the White House doubling down on that strategy, releasing a newly declassified Republican majority report from the House Intelligence Committee from back in 2020 and bringing Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard to today's briefing. Look.
The implications of this are far-reaching and have to do with the integrity of our democratic republic. It has to do with an outgoing president taking action to manufacture intelligence to undermine and usurp the will of the American people in that election and launch what would be a years-long coup against the incoming president of the United States, Donald Trump.
Now, the Trump administration's allegations that the Obama administration attempted to undermine his 2016 victory are demonstrably false and have been investigated and reinvestigated, including in a Trump-ordered investigation led by a Trump-appointed special counsel, which found no conspiracy to sabotage Mr. Trump. The Republican House report that Gabbard is citing came to a much different conclusion than the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee investigation, which affirmed Russia did attempt to help Trump in 2016 and which was chaired by now Secretary of State Marco Rubio. These allegations did succeed in temporarily shifting the conversation. Epstein didn't come up until nearly 40 minutes into a 50-minute-long White House briefing. But it appears unlikely it will be enough to move past the Epstein documents for long, as both the Department of Justice and House Republicans say they will seek to talk to Epstein's longtime partner and accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. And as some congressional Republicans continue to push for the so-called Epstein files to be released, this was North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis earlier today.
Release the damn files. Look, it makes no sense to me. One of two things is true, I believe. Either it's a nothing burger in terms of the evidence we have. Let's separate it from this guy being disgusting and what he did and the systematic trafficking of young people, minor-age people for sex purposes. But the promise to release the files during the campaign was either overplayed and we got a nothing burger if the files get released, or it's something really disturbing, and that's actually even a more compelling reason to release it.
Meanwhile, Democrats are delighting in Mr. Trump's self-inflicted backlash, slamming Republicans for how they've handled the controversy. Here are the Senate and House minority leaders earlier today.
The ghost of the disgraced Jeffrey Epstein is haunting our Republican colleagues, so much so that Speaker Johnson decided to cut bait and send the House home to escape discussions about Epstein.
Republicans are on the run. They can't even get their act together as it relates to releasing the Epstein files that every single one of the top leaders of the Trump Justice Department and the Trump FBI and the Vice President and the President himself promised to release.
But while Democrats see an opportunity to score political points, it remains unclear to what degree the Epstein controversy will animate constituents back home and take up oxygen at town halls as both parties head back to their districts for the summer and begin honing their midterm messages. Joining me now is White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard, Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell, and law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter. Thanks to all of you for starting us off today. Vaughn, let me head out to you first. We, of course, talked about at the top of the hour this new reporting from the Wall Street Journal. It says, according to senior administration officials, Attorney General Pam Bondi informed the president that his name was, in fact, the Epstein files. He'd actually been asked about that several days ago. He said he was told his name wasn't in there. So what is the White House saying?
Right. He pivoted when directly asked. And instead of the president here trying to move on from the Epstein files, this is a moment where this is going to be incumbent upon him to directly answer further questions about the relationship that he had with Jeffrey Epstein. We already knew that Jeffrey Epstein files included references to Donald Trump. For example, flight logs that apparently show that Donald Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane seven different times. Tom has done extensive reporting covering the Epstein trial as well as the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that shows the ways in which Donald Trump has been a longtime associate of Epstein. At the same time, to be specifically told by the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, here at the White House that his name is in the documents, and effectively that occurrence happens in parallel with the decision from this Department of Justice to not try to further release unredacted, broad scopes of evidence, other information. Those two realities really run perpendicular to one another here. And Stephen Chung, the communications director for the White House, he just issued a statement in response to this Wall Street Journal reporting in which he says, quote, "The fact is that the president kicked him out of his club for being a creep. This is nothing more than a continuation of the fake news stories concocted by the Democrats and the liberal media, just like the Obama Russiagate scandal, which President Trump was right about." There's a lot more questions for the president of the United States to answer, Kristen.
Well, absolutely. And on that note, let me go over to Tom Winter. Tom, so the Wall Street Journal has this reporting that Attorney General Bondi told President Trump his name appeared in the files. But we should be very clear about what that does and does not mean. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was any wrongdoing. It doesn't imply any guilt in and of itself. Correct, Tom?
I mean, 100%, Kristen. I can tell you that there are other federal cases where my name appears just because we did stories or articles that were later referenced in case files or in public filings and dockets, stories that we've done that have been quoted specifically. So it does not mean any criminality at all. I am not a federal criminal. So just to underscore that, and it is no surprise, as Vaughn alluded to, that the President of the United States is included in these files. As an example, in the Palm Beach police report files, a copy of which I have through public records, we have all of them. And in that is a Vanity Fair article that quotes now President Trump talking about Jeffrey Epstein and the fact that he seems to hang around with young girls. So that was included in the Palm Beach file, presumably copied over to the FBI's holdings. That's what they referred to on the matter. That's the files that everybody's talking about. And so, yeah, between that, the flight logs and several other things, I'm sure Trump's name appears in there often. I shouldn't say often, excuse me. It appears in there several times. And that does not mean that there's any sort of criminality or wrongdoing whatsoever. Even if somebody just said, hey, Tom, who did you talk to on Wednesday afternoon? Well, I was on air with Kristen Welker. I was on air with Zinkley. I was on air with this person, with Vaughn, with Andrea. It doesn't mean that any of those individuals did anything wrong. And so that's just an example of the type of thing that can come up.
You know, it's such an important clarification, Tom. Bring us up to speed, though, because we got some more breaking news today about that motion from DOJ to unseal the grand jury testimony. What did the judge rule in that case?
Yeah, it feels like it's every half hour we're getting filings now. It brings us back to when this case was live and, in fact, being tried. The latest ruling out of Florida is not one that is overly surprising. So the Justice Department asked under seal, can we get the grand jury materials that were heard before the federal grand jury in Florida before that infamous non-prosecution agreement was signed, the investigation there? Can we get that sent up to New York, where we are here, and can that be released as part of the transcripts we're hoping to get out through the Epstein case that was ultimately brought in New York? And a judge there said, look, I'm bound by an 11th Circuit opinion which says unless it's specifically spelled out in the Federal Criminal Rules of Procedure 6E, which governs grand jury secrecy in this country, across the country with federal courts, unless there's an exception in there that you can cite, I can't release those files. And as she says, and as the Justice Department alluded to in its sealed filing with the court, Your Honor, this doesn't necessarily fall under that. So case precedent rules the day there. That's not going to be transferred to New York. That doesn't necessarily stop, though, Kristen, the release of grand jury transcripts here in New York. It just means that it has to have been material that was heard by the grand jury here and not the grand jury in Florida. Quick update on the timing on that, both in the Maxwell and the Epstein case, the grand jury transcripts, at least until after August 5th, when the victims and the attorneys for either side in the Justice Department have had an opportunity to weigh in. It's only after that point that the judges will begin to consider whether they have a hearing or whether they issue a ruling. So nothing imminent on that front, at least not for the several weeks.
All right, Tom Winter, thank you so much for your great reporting on all of those angles. We really appreciate it. Vaughn, let me go back to you, because in this extraordinary moment, President Trump really said the quiet part out loud last night when he said that his focus on these, he tried to shift his focus to these debunked 2016 claims and basically said that that's what Republicans should be talking about if the Jeffrey Epstein matter comes up.
Right. I know that Andrea has deep reporting on the intelligence community, and going back to that rather short period of time between the election of President Trump in November 2016 and his inauguration in January of 2017. And I've been covering what was the campaign and candidacy of Donald Trump over the last several years, but also down in Mar-a-Lago back in 2021 after he left the White House. And there has been deep calls within MAGA circles to have former President Obama and other intelligence community officials, from James Clapper to Jim Comey to Brennan. This is for years now, an effort here to try to pin some sort of criminality on these individuals to justify what they say was an effort to undercut President Trump's first term in office and keep him from returning to power in 2024, making the case that this was a, quote, years-long conspiracy, as Tulsi Gabbard did from the White House briefing room podium today. But, Kristen, we should be very, very clear here. That is a large step that they are taking from internal deliberations in the intelligence community about the extent and the intent of Russia by its influence campaign in 2016 to undercut Hillary Clinton, and taking that next leap to make the claim that there was criminal conduct and a conspiracy being done by President Obama and the intelligence community. The Department of Justice is not actively investigating this as far as where we are aware, and they have not outlined specific allegations of crimes.
All right, Vaughn Hillyard, thank you so much for your great reporting. I do now want to turn to the great Andrea Mitchell joining us on set. Thank you for being here, Andrea, because there is a lot to pick through with this. As Vaughn just said, let's just pick up on what he said, which is basically that you have Tulsi Gabbard, the Trump administration, coming out and basically saying that they have uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to undercut then candidate Trump, President Trump's presidency, and that it was being led by President Obama and a range of other people. And they're citing this report that was put out by a Republican committee, which contradicts what was discovered by a bipartisan committee signed off on by Secretary of State, but then Senator Rubio. So break down this for us. What do people need to know about the facts here?
Well, first of all, President Trump yesterday accused one of his predecessors, President Obama, of treason. Treason is an act to betray the country by trying to overthrow it by waging war or giving material evidence and support to enemies of the United States. There is no way. Number two, John Durham, a Trump prosecutor, spent 3 years investigating this under President Trump, never found any wrongdoing, never reached the conclusion of that House Intelligence Committee report that was one party. They excluded all Democrats in a committee that had always been 50-50, Republican and Democratic, and always doing things in a bipartisan way. The Senate Intelligence Report earlier in 2017 did not come to any such conclusion. And no congressional report ever said or accused Donald Trump or the Trump campaign of trying to consort with Russia. It said that Russia had tried to influence the election through social media, attempting to hack, occasionally actually hacking into some machines, not changing any votes, not affecting the election outcome. That was never the conclusion. It was unanimous. Republicans and Democrats, led by Marco Rubio, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee at the time, John Durham, then investigated for 3 years under Donald Trump, never prosecuted, never referred anyone to the Justice Department. So for Tulsi Gabbard to say today she was referring to President Obama, John Brennan, and these others to the Justice Department, and then when asked on what grounds, saying, well, that's up to the Justice Department, that's sort of a dark hole. That's throwing something up, throwing some mud up, and never coming up with the accusation. And may I just say that there is a Supreme Court decision in the case of Donald J. Trump saying that a president of the United States cannot be prosecuted for offenses allegedly occurring while he was in office, which would mean that President Obama cannot be prosecuted.
It's such a
even if this
critical
were
point.
true.
Yeah.
So it's really a pile of nothing. And we've gone through it. I covered it at the time. We covered it. We did not cover or carry the report that is the dossier that was, widely, criticized. The other thing is that John Warner, the current ranking person on intelligence, who worked very closely with Marco Rubio when Rubio was chair or vice chair. So when the two were partners, and praised him at the time. He has issued a statement today saying that release, the declassification of some of the materials that Tulsi Gabbard declassified, has compromised sources and methods regarding Russian intelligence.
Yeah, he clearly outraged by this. Andrea, really an extraordinary fact check of one of the more complicated, I think, twists of this. Great to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.